Good morning, everyone, and good evening to our audience joining from Korea. Welcome to GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIKS. I'm Yeonho Kim, Associate Director at GWIKS. Thank you for joining our Korea Policy Forum. The forum is part of the policy program at GWIKS, focusing on discussing current Korea-related policy issues in the domestic, regional, and global context. And today's forum is co-sponsored by the East Asia National Resource Center. With the new U.S. administration coming in next January, I think we will see changes in and around the Korean Peninsula in many ways. And we invited both American and Korean journalists to discuss the results of the election and prospects for U.S. Korea and inter-Korean relations. And I'm very delighted to have four distinguished speakers to cover these issues from Washington and Seoul. Let me briefly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Sungmin Kim. She's a White House reporter for the Washington Post. Before joining the Washington Post, she spent more than 8 years at Politico. Sungmin is also an on-air political analyst for CNN. And our next speaker is Anthony Kuhn, Seoul correspondent for NPR. He previously served as NPR correspondent in Beijing, Jakarta, and London. And prior to joining NPR, he wrote for the Far Eastern Economic Review. Our third speaker is Heejun Kim, the newsroom director of the Department of Inter-Korean Unification, Foreign Affairs, and National Security at YTN. She is a former Washington correspondent and was a professional fellow at Weatherhead East Asian Institute of Columbia University. And last but not least, In-sun Kang is the deputy managing editor at the Chosun Ilbo. She's a former Washington bureau chief and a member of the editorial board. And prior to this role, she was the editor of the International News and Weekend section. And with that, let me turn it over to Sungmin.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So my name is Sungmin Kim, and I have been covering the Trump White House for the Washington Post, and particularly its relationship with Capitol Hill for the past 2.5 years. And we've seen how, how very unpredictable the Trump White House and the Trump administration could be in so many things. And it's just in its everyday dealings with government, in certainly its foreign affairs, particularly its policy or the president's policy towards the Korean Peninsula, their interactions with Capitol Hill, and whatnot. And we are now covering a bit of a transition. Obviously, former Vice President Biden was declared the winner on Saturday evening. He is at least trying to start the process of an official transition and to kind of get with the business of transition and with governing, and is struggling to do that a little bit because the current president of the United States, President Trump, has not conceded the victory, or has not conceded to Vice President Biden, and more importantly, hasn't allowed his government to sort of unlock the keys to the transition for Biden and his team to start. So that's kind of the transition that we are covering right now. But obviously, there is a lot to talk about today in terms of, the expected shift that we're going to see with, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration when it comes to foreign policy. How long it takes for President Trump to actually leave and acknowledge that the presidency is lost for him, and what he does for the next 2 months or so until January 20th, when he does have to leave office and Joe Biden takes over. Obviously, their respective relationships with the press are an interesting topic as well. And their relationships with Capitol Hill. There is a what's been really interesting is that most presidential elections, when there are congressional elections going on at the same time, we usually know which party is going to control the House and the Senate and the White House. This year, we don't. Right now, all eyes, the eyes that aren't looking at the presidential recounts and what the president's campaign's doing right now, all political eyes are on Georgia, where it was unusual enough that there are 2 Senate races in Georgia this year. One was made because a former Georgia senator retired because of health reasons. So one is a special election. But because of the quirky way that that Georgia elections work, if no candidate clears 50%, the top 2 candidates in each race, regardless of party, heads to a runoff. We expected at least one runoff for one of the races, but now the other one is going to a runoff as well. And the math just worked out in the Senate races that the Senate majority, who controls the Senate, and by extension, who can block a President Biden's agenda, who can ensure that his cabinet nominees and his judicial nominees can get confirmed, really depends on these 2 races. So that's going to be a lot of our attention. And that's a really unusual situation for a president to be going in. First of all, if the Senate stays in Republican hands, it'll be the first, Biden will be the first president since I believe H.W. Bush to head into his administration without a unified government, to have a Senate of an opposing party. So that in itself has many interesting dynamics for us to talk about and for us to cover, certainly for us journalists to cover for the next 2 years until the next congressional elections, but also the fact that we just simply do not know, that everything is kind of suspended and in air, and in terms of what's going to happen in the Senate until January 5th is an interesting and an unusual dynamic as well. So there's a lot to discuss. Looking forward to your questions on the outgoing Trump administration, what the president does in the interim, and what the Biden administration has planned in terms of personnel policy and the press.
Hey, thank you. I think Sungmin just raised a lot of interesting questions that we'll be discussing in the latter part of our seminar. Anthony, you're next.
Annyeonghaseyo to everyone from beautiful autumnal Seoul. It's a great pleasure to join all of you for this webinar at a very interesting and important time. I'll just say that, you know, although it's my job to be sensitive to these sort of things, I really have felt through the Korean people what is going on inside the United States throughout the entire year, whether it's COVID, racial injustice, protests, political rancor in the atmosphere. And I feel these things in so many different ways. I feel them when I look on the streets at Gwanghwamun and I see the Taegukgi protesters with their, you know, pro-Trump flags. They hung a poster congratulating President Trump on his victory near the High Court, even though he had already lost. I felt it through people, you know, contemplating the ways in which South Korea's political system was built on the U.S. system, the presidential system, which is, you know, people are considering how well is it still working? Where does it need to be reformed? Including, you know, the military presence. Today, we received a notice saying that, you know, more than 20 servicemen had arrived and tested positive for COVID. I think of gestures such as, for example, President Moon Jae-in presiding over the sending of face masks to Korean War veterans, sort of reversing the flow of help that people are sort of used to thinking about. So I really feel that, you know, what happens in the US domestically and politically has a real impact, because they have to do with an ally's stability, its reliability, and its political will to focus and deal with challenges that are half a world away. And so I think people are expecting a president who, as vice president, made a point of trying to lead by example, which I think is very important for an ally, one who said he's going to try to heal divisions, build up the United States from within, rather than trying to defeat competitors' advantages. And I just think all of these things will hopefully go a long way to inspiring confidence and restore trust. Obviously, everyone here has been discussing like crazy what's going to happen with North Korea policy. We've, since Biden's, since the media calling the election for Biden, there's been no comment at all out of Pyongyang. And people have also noticed that there's been no mention of North Korea in President-elect Biden's transition website, and neither of these things bode too well. We also see, I think you can say, lowered expectations from the public because of what they expect from Biden's North Korea policy. There was a Real Meter poll on Friday that said that about half of respondents predict no major change to inter-Korean relations during a Biden administration. More than a quarter think things will get worse, and only 16% predict improvement. People are looking to see whether North Korea will resort to provocations early on in the Biden administration, as they have a history of doing. Well, there are certainly reasons why they might not want to do that. They know how the US works, that it will take time for the Biden administration to put its team and policies together. Also, China might want to step in and prevent them from lashing out too quickly and say, please don't provoke anyone until we tell you to. And they also know perfectly well, the history of democratic administrations' efforts to reach out and engage with North Korea, from the agreed framework and the Perry process of the Clinton administration to the Leap Day deal of the Obama administration. And they're also very familiar in Pyongyang with the players in democratic administrations, many of whom advocate a sort of Iran-style arms control deal rather than all in one go denuclearization. And Biden's aides have indicated that they would be willing to meet with Kim if they think progress is possible, although they make it clear that they will not, they will be engaging in principled diplomacy, different from the Trump administration. We will also be looking to see how South Korea pivots in its role, having been heavily invested in brokering the summits of the past few years, to sort of trying to lead a more multilateral process and integrating that with inter-Korean outreach efforts. I also happen to cover Japan, so I'm very interested to see how Washington manages relations with Seoul and Tokyo. Of course, we always have to remind people it's not a tripartite alliance. There's a U.S. Korea alliance and there's a U.S. Japan alliance. And criticism was that the Trump administration let historical issues between Seoul and Tokyo fester until it boiled over into a trade dispute, and then South Korea threatened to pull out of GSOMIA. Well, the hope is that Biden will act quickly, that he will remain neutral and not take sides in these disputes, because it can't really affect what are very much nationalistic and domestic political issues. On two other major alliance issues, defense cost sharing and OPCON transfer, I think it should be pretty easy for President Biden to reverse the mistakes of the Trump administration, not treat Seoul as someone to be shaken down for money, and on OPCON transfer, not appear to be dragging its heels. Just, when South Korea's military meets the benchmarks, just certify them and keep the process moving ahead. Finally, I have my eye out, so I've sort of been avoiding the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that is how the U.S. will deal with China. China is, of course, going to remain the U.S.'s peer competitor, and I expect that the Biden administration will engage to some degree, or maybe even cooperate on issues such as, non-security issues such as public health and climate change. It's not going to cede primacy or hegemony to China and Asia for certain. And I would also add that one of the things that I'm watching that is clearly going to have a huge impact on South Korea is that the US military is rethinking its position and has made it clear that currently the US is set up to fight a second Korean War, and that's not going to happen. And so the future military footprint of the United States is going to be vastly different, and it will not be all bunched up in massive installations like Camp Humphreys down in Pyeongtaek. They're going to have to spread forces out to deal with the threat of Chinese and North Korean missiles. Also, my guess is that Washington will tone down its effort to sort of hector allies, to pick sides between the US and China, and to assemble a coalition to confront or contain China. But hopefully it will continue to try to build regional security architecture, which is very much needed. And I think we saw from Secretary of State Pompeo's recent swing through the region that this effort to say China is the predator, China is the malign actor, you've got to be on our side, did not get great results. That that sort of language was not repeated by any other country during that trip. And I would not be in the least surprised if the US either toned down or just quietly ditched a whole range of initiatives aimed at China, the Economic Prosperity Network, the Clean Network Program, et cetera. We all know that South Korean and Japanese firms are diversifying their production bases out of China, but because it makes business sense and not because it's a government fiat. And that's what I'd like to see more of from the Biden administration. You may have noticed that chip makers like Samsung and Hynix saw their stocks in Seoul jump on the Biden win because they expect the US is not going to try to limit their sales to Chinese companies. And so, you know, also I think hopefully just the ideological language, the reds under the bed sort of stuff will fade away and policy will become more pragmatic. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking very much to answering the toughest questions you can muster. Thank you.
Thank you. We already have some questions in advance, so stay tuned, Anthony. So I think Anthony played a role of the perfect bridge, if you will, from Washington to Seoul. So our next speaker, Heejun Kim, will be discussing the reactions and in Korea and their prospects and the expectations of a new situation in and around the Korean Peninsula. Heejun.
Hello, I'm Heejun Kim from YTN, a 24-hour news channel of Korea. Thanks for having me, and I'm very pleased to be part of today's very meaningful discussions. Actually, Yono introduced me. I was a Washington correspondent from 2016, 2019. At the time, I covered the news of the presidential election of the Trump, and then I spent just 3 years just for unpredictable. Just every morning I just saw what he's tweeted, and then there was a lot of up and downs from fire and fury to the first summit in Singapore and second summit in Hanoi, and then firstly I will review briefly the Korea's response on the President-elect Biden. And then I would like to talk about several issues, North Korean and then U.S.-China conflict, with ROK and U.S. alliance have to solve. The overall sentiment of South Korean Biden's victory is relief. People seem to expect Biden will ease the tensions and uncertainty that Trump has infused bilaterally and globally over the past 4 years. Since Biden's election, the Korean government and foreign and defense authority and political and business circles have been busy to connect Biden and his key aides to establish stable relationship with the new U.S. administration. The message from Korean government is cautious but very clear, just emphasizing the strong and rock-solid ROK-U.S. alliance and its unwavering determination on denuclearization of Korean Peninsula and establishing peace regime. Actually, President Moon Jae-in said yesterday his government will have multi-sided communication with Joe Biden in order to ensure that there is no vacuum in the alliance and the Korean peace process. Actually, Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa is visiting Washington now and met her counterpart, Mike Pompeo. Minister Kang's trip to Washington came at a dicey time on the heat of Joe Biden's victory, but this will be an opportunity to reaffirm the Korea-US alliance. Her visit seemed to focus on meeting with Biden's advisors to pursue reaching out to Biden's side during this delicate transition period. In the upcoming 2 months, maybe Seoul is expected to pursue active diplomacy for direct communication between President Moon and the President-elect Biden, while paying close attention to the formation of the Biden government and diplomatic and security themes. Actually, the building mutual trust between the two leaders will be an important step in coordinating a common policy toward North Korea. In this regard, actually, Cheong Wa-dae is trying to arrange a phone call between Moon and Biden as soon as possible. Also, face-to-face meeting of the two leaders after Biden's inaugurations. Actually, I would like to ask some questions. The Biden's administration will be the third Clinton terms on North Korea issues or return to the Obama strategic patience. The winning of Biden could be a good thing in the aspect of having a new leader who is more predictable, rational, and who appreciates the value of alliance, comparing his predecessors, President Trump. However, Korean government and people with liberal tendency are concerned on Biden's approach on North Korean issue. Actually, Anthony quoted the Real Meter poll. All we know, Trump and Biden's view on North Korea are sharply different. Trump said Kim Jong Un's friend, but Biden accused him as a thug and dictator. Also, North Korea criticized Biden as a crazy dog. They gave and took harsh rhetoric. So, given that Biden prepares a bottom-up approach with North Korea, unlike President Trump's top-down diplomacy that second nuclear deal in a comprehensive ways, Moon government will have challenges to reopen inter-Korean and U.S.-North Korean dialogue and engagement. Actually, South Korea has wishful thinking that the Biden administration could be a third term of Clinton administration instead of a third Obama terms. Unification Minister Ri In-young pointed out that Joe Biden may not necessarily return to former President Obama's policy strategic patient toward North Korea. But some criticize that Seoul's view may be too optimistic. It will be a more challenging job if Biden appointed hardliners as Susan Rice and Tony Blinken, thus rebuilding trust in not only U.S. and North Korea, but also ROK and U.S. will be a difficult job to Moon's administrations. And then South Korea breathed a sigh relief with election of Biden because he is expected to deal with alliance issues like defense cost sharing in a more reasonable way than Trump. However, the Biden administration will also seek to carry out its own interest in another security issues like the transfer of wartime operational controls. This means a long and rough road remains to our alliance. As Anthony pointed out, given that Biden has stressed the confrontation with China, he may demand Seoul's contribution to press on China. This will be a new task for Korean government also. It is true that Washington tried to build a front line against China, considering Quad and Quad Plus by adding Korea and Vietnam. And Korean government is reluctant to join Quad Plus because it could harm to Korean-China relationship. However, there is a possibility that Biden government will step up pressure on China through cooperation with the international community. It will be a challenge to Moon's government too. And then we have to think about the impact of conflict between U.S.-China on North Korea itself. The deepening conflict between the great two countries could lead North Korea and China to strengthening their three-way alliance with Russia. We saw that North Korea had stressed its favorable ties with China on the day of U.S. presidential elections. This will make it more difficult for South Korea to play a mediator role in resolving the denuclearization issues. Also, the U.S.-China threat is competition could limit China's cooperation in resolving the North Korean nuclear issues. As China's leverage role is crucial in North Korean issues, so ROK US have to find a way that induce China can do more productive role on that issues. And then I would like to point out the trilateral cooperation in the U.S. and Japan and Korea. As part of U.S.'s struggle with China, the U.S. is expected to keep pressing South Korea and Japan, the two key allies in the Indo-Pacific, to improve their relationship, as Obama administration did, while the Biden administration's the broccoli effort will actively or not much actively than Obama administrations. I would like to discuss this matter later too. Okay, I will wrap up my presentation and I will talk later in the discussion sessions.
Thank you, Heejun. It was a really comprehensive description of what South Korean people are thinking of after the election. Our last but not least speaker, In-sun Kang, she's joining us. In-sun, let me turn it over to In-sun.
Hello. Before talking about the overall reaction from Korean society, I just want to talk about my experience with President Trump. I have spent 4 years in Washington, D.C. From 2016 to 2020, which is just overwhelmed by Trump presidency. So when I got to know the result of this election, I thought, I felt I was released from Trump presidency. So which means I thought I was kind of kidnapped by President Trump presidency, because you cannot just take your eyes off from whatever president has said or has done. And when you look back upon those 4 years, I had to write about him, whatever he has done. And then I had to travel with him to Singapore and Hanoi, and wherever he went, we need to follow him. So it was a very, the pressure was much stronger than I thought. When that was something I realized when this election was over. And people just expected we could be back to the normal or the standard or the tradition or whatever the United States that we knew before. But 4 years is a long time. And so many things has changed. Not only the domestic politics in the United States, but also the regional politics in Asia and other countries too. So I guess we will just take out all those Trumpian things relatively easily, but those changes are mixed with other changes, structural changes. So it will take time to figure out what we would do with Biden administration. So I remember that when just after the inauguration of the Trump administration, it will take about a few months to review all those policies over for Korean Peninsula. So this time we just easily expect that things will be back to 4 years ago, but I don't think it's that easy. So I mean, think of those. There are so many issues were up in the air, like SMA and then upcon control and or other issues related with that. But we just take out Trump specific factors, but there are still other issues we need to handle. So it will be more complicated to set up a new relations with South Korean government and the Biden government. So I have lots of expectations about that, but also I have another concerns over the new relations too. Yeah, I will just stop here.
Thank you, Insan. So I think we covered a very wide range of issues and concerns and expectations, and I'd like to ask the panelists to discuss among themselves for about 10 minutes. If you have any comments or questions for other panelists, please let me know. And let me start with this. Sungmin, so after you hear from your Korean friends, was there any surprising or interesting things going on in Korea that you didn't expect?
I think any sort of the dynamic between the new administration in Washington and Korea, Japan, China were all interesting points and will be interesting to watch. I think the thinking has been that obviously, I mean, there is a reason we haven't heard any words of congratulations or acknowledge from Kim Jong Un, and I think that was pretty expected because of the warm relationship that President Trump has had with him. But I'm interested. I know some of the panelists touched on this, but I'm really interested in hearing more about the role that President Moon will take in this relationship when he has staked out so much of his presidency on reconciliation between the Koreas, and the incoming Biden administration and Biden himself has made it clear he's not going to go back to sort of that warm relationship. I mean, President Trump was really criticized not only by Democrats but by Republicans for granting this giving Kim Jong Un legitimacy by giving him 3 meetings with the President of the United States, the most powerful person in the world, without Kim Jong Un giving anything in return. So I think it's kind of obvious how Kim Jong Un would react, but when Moon's kind of political future and his agenda has been staked out so much on the reconciliation, how does he manage a U.S. administration that doesn't have that same posture? Particularly as I understand the economy continues to struggle in Korea, so this is kind of still his big issue. So I would be interested in hearing just more from the panelists about that. And I think one of the points, I believe Heejun raised it, and if there's, it's all premature now, but some points where we can discuss more about how critical President Biden's appointments to national security positions will mean towards their policy towards the Korean Peninsula. You mentioned, for example, Susan Rice has been taking a similarly kind of tough tone and a hard line towards North Korea. I can tell you that from our perspective, just on the domestic politics of it, if Republicans do end up controlling the Senate, it becomes infinitely harder for someone like Susan Rice to be confirmed in the United States Senate. Republicans have already said that her history, kind of explaining the Benghazi attacks in 2012, is going to really be held against her So if Republicans do end up controlling the majority, the president-elect Biden may have to look elsewhere. But I'm interested in hearing what kind of signals you're looking for through Biden's appointments, particularly, and what that may signal to not just Korea policy, but to the broader East Asia policy, which is going to be so important for any administration.
Okay, thank you. Heejun, do you have any response?
First of all, in Kim Jong Il's thinking of what he is thinking about, actually, after the Biden's elections, North Korea is silent for 3 days. Maybe he is just weighing the North Korea's interest and North Korea's gaining and lost from the Biden's administrations. And after a long thinking, maybe the North Korea will react. So I and my colleagues and our government also just looking for what will be the first reaction from North Korea. And then, as Seungmin has said, actually, it is true that the liberal Moon Jae-in administration is a little worried about the Biden's election in regarding of the just the North Korean issues. Our government is thinking, our government that just emphasize that just to start from the last 3 years, it means the first and second summit between ROK and U.S. And Singapore and Hanoi will be must be the starting point to just negotiating with North Korea, but our government knows it's not easy because the President-elect Biden has a very strong position, and then a strong position on North Korea. So actually, and then I myself interviewed the Tony Blinken in 2015. Actually, I asked him that if North Korea make some provocations, it would be a game changer. And then he answered that will be a very big game changer. So the U.S. will tolerate any provocation from North Korea. So I think that so in this situation, that Moon administration's role is very important, just to mediate and then reduce the gap between the North Korea and Biden administrations. And then actually, I would like to point out one more things. Another problem between the ROK US is any time frame gap. I mean, actually, Moon's presidency is running out of time, actually. South Korea's next presidential election is scheduled for March 2022. Thus, the latter half of next year will be a presidential election campaign mode. So, and then in Biden administration side, it could take around 6 months to announce a new foreign policy, including North Korea. So negotiations with the North Korea could be expected to begin in the latter half of the half of next year at the earliest. So this kind of time frame gap between US and ROK might lose some momentum to resume talks with North Korea. This will be a challenge to South Korean government too, I think.
Thank you, Heejun. Insan, do you have any comments?
Well, I think it's a little too, it's premature to say anything about Biden's position or policies on North Korea or Korean Peninsula. But I guess the interesting part is that whether we see what President Trump has done with North Korea is a real achievement, or it's just a personal relations with, I mean, between two leaders. So what I understand is that President Moon Jae-in and his advisors regard that as a very important achievement in improving U.S. DPRK relations, so that they want to keep them as it is and then start and improve from that point, so that, I mean, major issues how to improve the relations between South and North Korea with the improve the relations with the U.S. and DPRK relations. But if President Trump is gone, and that friendship between President Trump and Kim Jong Un is gone, and then what's left in that scene? So in that case, Biden administration should start from the scratch, which means perhaps it's going back to somewhere in 2017, which we call a kind of crisis. So, so I think, you know, how they assess the current situation. I mean, that starting point is very different from from Moon Jae-in's government and Biden's team. I mean, I guess there may be quite a big gap, and the reason why Moon Jae-in governments and Moon Jae-in governments, you know, has kind of hurry up to fly over to Washington D.C. to meet some people from Biden camps. I'm not really sure that she has met someone over there, but the action that they have shown so far is that to make them understand what Moon Jae-in government and Trump administration has done so far. So I guess that, I mean, assessment of what those two governments has done for the last few years I think that's a critical point for the starting point for Biden government.
Thank you. Before we open it up for Q&A, I'd like to ask one quick question for Anthony. So we just heard that all the policy changes we can expect under the Biden administration wouldn't be that immediate. You know, we can easily expect some coordination challenges or other domestic political challenges in the U.S. So, Anthony, do you also hear from your colleagues and friends in Washington about this concerns?
Well, I agree with the issue of the time frame, and I suppose a worst case scenario is that you write off the first year to Biden finding his legs, and you write off the second year to Moon being a lame duck. And in that case, I would just say it's terrible. It's a terrible shame, because you actually have 2 years here in which both countries are led by Democratic parties, and they should have some similarities, as you know, as the Obama administration used to say, if the autocrats will unclench their fists, we will reach out our hands. So I just hope they can fulfill their promise. Let's put it that way.
Okay, thank you. We already have 13 questions. A couple of them we already covered. So let me start with this question. Olivia Lonely, a student. And the question is, are there any differences between how the youth and mainstream politics are responding to the US election? This seemed to be addressed to our Korean correspondent, Korean reporters.
I don't think that is generational differences. I don't see any, let's say the youth, support Biden more than Trump. I don't see that kind of opinions, I mean, at least around me. So I don't think it's generational thing.
I will add something. Yeah, as Insun said, I agree with her. So this is not a matter of generation, but the matter of the political orientations. Actually, previously, the Anthony quoted, the Korean people are following the election, the U.S. President Joe Biden, and turns out that we don't expect much about the prospect for inter-Korean relations. Actually, YTN conducted this poll, and then so the nearly half of the respondents expected there will be no big change, and 16% expected it will get worse. Only 16% expected it will better. And then there is a contrast according to the respondent political orientations. Among the supporters of the Liberal Democratic Party, and 33% answered the relationship will be worse. But among conservative parties, the 19% answered in the same way. So I think this poll clearly shows that how the Korean people react to the U.S. elections. So it is very, very connected with the political orientation. It's liberal or conservative, I think.
Yes, Insun.
I would like to have this in.
I may add one more thing. I remember that when there was a very hawkish, when President Trump had a very hawkish stance against North Korea, in that situation, the conservatives supported President Trump quite strongly, I remember. And then President Trump changed his position drastically, and then he did the summit with Kim Jong Un, and then they got a great friendship between two, and then he was very friendly to North Korea. And then somehow the expectation about the breakthrough and then a drastic, development of the United States and DPRK, I mean, that expectation went up. And then in that case, more progressives support President Trump. So it's not age issues. So usually it's, as Heejun said, it's more like it has something to do with political orientation and then your position on North Korean issues.
Thank you. Our next question is from Garrett May, GW law student. So do you think the U.S. position with the Philippines and conflict with China comes to bear on foreign policy with Korea? So Anthony, did you want to go first?
Well, the Philippines is supposed to be a like-minded partner with the U.S. There's been a long history of alliance and ties, but it's been different under Duterte. There have been a lot of frictions with the U.S. The relationship is, the military relationship has changed a lot since the U.S. has not been using Clark and Subic Bay bases. However, the Philippine military, of course, tends to be much more pro-U.S. A lot of the officers were trained by the U.S. and would like to see a closer relationship. So, I mean, I think, the whole question of Southeast Asia is very, very important to everyone in the neighborhood. It's what, it's what the Quad is about to a certain extent, about, involvement in the South China Sea issue, about gathering together so-called like-minded nations. I think just for US allies in general, the Trump administration has caused a sort of unease among allies on both sides, either that they'd get entangled in the US's conflicts with China or other powers, or that they'd be abandoned as the US finds its homeland threatened by, for example, North Korean missiles, and decides to worry more about that than its allies in the region, or its its military bases in the region. And one of the subjects of discussion between Kang Kyung-hwa and Pompeo has been how to find some synergy between South Korea's so-called Southern policy and the US's so-called free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, I think it's going to be very difficult because I think to a certain extent, South Korea's Southern policy is meant to, to be more independent and not exclude China necessarily, and not rile up economic partners such as China. So I'm very interested to see what kind of synergy and cooperation they can find among those two initiatives. But Southeast Asia is so important to the US and Japan and many companies' efforts to diversify their production bases out of China. It's very difficult. China is pricing itself out of the market because of rising wages and other costs. And Southeast Asia is just going to take a long time to ramp up its infrastructure and labor pool so where it can match that. So it's going to be a very long process, and it's very hard for any government to do this by fiat, to tell companies to get out of China and go to Southeast Asia.
Thank you. Let me take two questions. I think that are for Seungmin. So the first one is from Helen Zhang, program coordinator for Seoul Center at GW. So what do you expect to change when it comes to reporting on the White House? And the second question is from Jae-bum Kim, Executive Vice Chairman of Korea America Association. When do you think President Trump will admit the victory of former Vice President Biden?
Two very good questions. The first one is going to be really interesting. So I've only covered, in my capacity as a White House correspondent, I've only covered the Trump White House. So I'm used to a White House where policies are announced via tweet even before the staff had prepared any proposal or was ready to roll out a new idea. We were ready for the president to really change the news cycle on a whim. Obviously, I expect that Joe Biden would be tweeting a little less and making news that way. And the Trump administration really has had, frankly, a brutal relationship with the press. I think we expect every White House press corps, regardless of who is in the White House, whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, to be adversarial. And that's the kind of relationship that we want. You want a tough and aggressive White House press corps, regardless of who is in power, to ask the tough questions, to keep any administration in check. But this president and this administration went pretty far. They have, blocked certain people from, getting credentials. They have granted access to outlets that I think we can fairly consider to be propaganda outlets. They had, until President Trump's fourth press secretary came, Kayleigh McEnany, the current White House press secretary, there had stopped being press briefings for a while. They have said things that were false, flatly not true, whether it is Sean Spicer on the first days of the Trump administration, exaggerating the crowd sizes of the president's inauguration, to the many falsehoods that Kayleigh McEnany says now. So it's been, and also, frankly, the president's personal insulting of, different reporters, various outlets, really, painting the media as the enemy, which is new. I mean, no president obviously likes an aggressive press corps, but the way that he has demonized the press corps is something that I think will leave a long impact. I think you see that a lot of times among his supporters, and the kind of distrust that he has tried to or the mistrust that he has tried to foment in the news media, accusing us of inflating coronavirus figures or whatnot. I think that's a pretty dangerous repercussion that unfortunately will last for a while. In terms of access, the president, for all the criticisms that we have had of first the president and his inability to speak the truth, and obviously the lack of press briefings under under a few of the press secretaries under the administration, this president has been accessible in his own way. He, almost every photo op or every departure on Marine One, when he leaves for an out of town event, he does take questions. And it's a very chaotic environment, especially on the South Lawn of the White House when the helicopter is whirring and you can't hear a lot. So he can kind of pick and choose what questions he hears and answers. But he does take questions and frequently, which is something that on an impromptu occasion, which is something that his predecessors did not do. And something that I don't expect Joe Biden to do either. A lot of this was deliberate campaign strategy to keep Joe Biden out of the spotlight, not pepper him in an environment where multiple reporters are asking him questions in a tough environment. But it's unclear whether he's going to be more accessible to the White House press corps once he's officially in the White House. One thing to remember is that during the Biden campaign, when now President-elect Biden was traveling to various campaign stops, he and his staff took one plane and the press took another plane. That's not just travel logistics or us wanting to be on a nice plane. That means access and the ability to answer and ask questions of someone who is running for the presidency of the United States. I've been on Air Force One several times where the president comes back to the back of the plane and he answers a lot of questions from us. Oftentimes it's off the record, but a lot of times we've been able to get some of these answers on the record. So it remains to be seen how accessible Joe Biden himself will be to the press corps, and that's going to be a relationship that's really important for us to be able to do our jobs. So on the second question, when the president admits the victory of Joe Biden, it's going to take a while. I think the president, there are two things that are being said publicly and privately. So publicly, most Republicans and the president himself and his campaign team are saying it's nowhere near over. We are launching legal battles in several key states to effectively weed out ballots that they feel are, illegal and should not be counted. They have shown absolutely no evidence of voter fraud. We have asked, the campaign is even crowdsourcing its supporters and its surrogates for potential examples of voter fraud, saying they will investigate every single one. But privately, even people working for the president or people surrounding him say this is all kind of for show. This is kind of to allow him to come to terms with his loss kind of in his own time. Obviously, the one thing that the president hates more than anything else is being a loser, and he is clearly a loser now. So a lot of this is, again, for the publicity of it, for the show of it, to show his supporters that he's still going on, but also to kind of let Trump come to accept his loss in his own time. And a lot of that is positioning. A lot of that positioning is why you're seeing some of the rhetoric that you're seeing from Republicans on Capitol Hill. It's really, I can count on one hand, maybe I just need 4 fingers, of the number of Senate Republicans who've just merely congratulated Biden and Senator Kamala Harris for becoming president-elect and vice president-elect. So the fact that you can only I can only think of 4 Republicans who've done that, several days or 2 days after the race was called for him, now a week after the election, is pretty remarkable. And you have Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell going to the Senate floor. Obviously, a big figure in the party. If anyone can kind of talk Trump to his senses, it might be someone like Mitch McConnell. And he went on the floor and talked about potential voter fraud and the fact that the president has every 100% the right to investigate these potential allegations of voter fraud, again, for which Mitch McConnell did not provide any evidence. But privately, congressional Republicans tell us the same thing. You know, first of all, there's no benefit unless you're someone like Mitt Romney, who you are kind of a figure in the Republican Party in your own right. There is no upside for elected Republican officials to get crosswise with the president in public and kind of gently kind of prod him to concede or at least admit defeat. We know he's probably never going to give the kind of gracious concession speech that we've seen from previous presidential candidates who were defeated. But right now they're kind of all in suspension mode and kind of, you know, almost coddling him until he kind of comes to the terms with his own loss. So when the president actually admits the victory, I don't think he'll, first of all, ever gracefully concede and give a speech. That's important to remember. I think after a couple of weeks, when judges in various states keep turning away these legal challenges waged by the campaign, people around him will kind of say, look, we've kind of reached the end of the road on this. But I feel like we've got at least, you know, a couple more weeks to go of at least, I think, of this kind of legal fight where the president refuses to acknowledge that he has lost. And it's remarkable too that we have not seen him in public since Thursday. I mean, this is someone who, you know, obviously is out front in front of the cameras, talking almost every day, particularly if he wants to shape a narrative or shape a message. But all we're hearing right now is from his Twitter feed. And it is kind of remarkable that he has been publicly not seen since Thursday. Vice President Pence, after a meeting on Capitol Hill today, he's actually going on vacation for the next several days. So he doesn't seem to be completely in the fight either. But I do think we have at least several more days of this for now.
Okay, we'll see. Thank you. Next question is from Marcy Tanter, professor at Tarleton State University. Why doesn't the American government have advisors who are more knowledgeable on Korean culture and society? And I would ask this question. So Anthony, I think you are in a good position to answer this question. Do you think the Biden's Korea team will be strong enough? How strong do you think his Korea team will be?
I hope every single one of them will be perfectly fluent in Korean, but I can't guarantee that will happen. My personal feeling is that illiteracy in Asian cultures and geopolitics is a problem that plagues not only American media, but American government and many other spheres of life in America. And it's a long battle, which I have to face every day. And my personal feeling is, well, you know, the government has a system for diplomats to get them to study language and serve in many countries around the world. And, you know, foreign correspondents in journalism rotate between tours of duty in other countries, and it's up to them to get up to speed in current events and culture and language. But I just feel that, okay, I'll give you an example that caught my attention yesterday. The Kim Dae-jung Presidential Library here in Seoul published letters from then Senator Biden to Kim Dae-jung when he was in Alexandria, Virginia, in exile in 1983 and 1984, and trying to get support from U.S. politicians. And the letter began by addressing the soon-to-be president, Kim Dae-jung, as "Dear Ms. Jung." Now, I can only assume that the person saw Kim Dae-jung's name and said, oh, you know, Kim is a woman's name, so it must be Ms. Jung. Very depressing, very embarrassing. But, you know, as I say, it's a problem that affects all areas of American society. We say we're trying to pivot to Asia, which is now the most important, place in the world, but we're constantly distracted by things happening elsewhere. And, whether it's politicians answering questions or journalists asking them, they're just never really up to speed. So it's something that's got to be addressed through education and through effort at all levels of society. That's all I can say.
Thank you. Next question is from Hanbin Park. Question to all panelists. What do you think is the one of Biden's first actions as president will be, especially to South Korea and North Korea? I would ask the Korean friends, what do you think the South Korean side is expecting or wanting to be Biden's first action on the Korean Peninsula?
In a very realistic positions, and in retrospect, the Moon's administration started on the very first day. President Moon and Trump exchanged telephone conversations. So during the conversation, they agreed to strong alliance and an ironclad defense against the North Korean threat. So in the Korea's positions, Korean diplomat, it is very important the first phone call from President Biden, and then the first summit is also very important to coordinate the two countries' policies on North Korea. So I think the lack of preparation for the summit with Biden could lead to failure. So our diplomatic authority must fully prepare. And then actually my wistful thinking is it will be a good from President Biden's the message that he would like to have a conversation with Kim Jong Un directly in near the future. Maybe it'll be a good sign to Korean Peninsula.
Thank you. In-sun?
I guess the first thing that Koreans expect from the Biden president-elect is getting our confidence back. I mean, like we had quite a solid confidence about our alliance, U.S.-RK alliance, but we have been losing that a lot during the Trump presidency. As we have seen, we thought alliance is based on our, we are under the same threat from the North Korea, and then we have that blood, it was bloody, how do you call it? Bloody alliance because of the Korean War. We always 혈맹, that's what we called the relations between South Korea and the United States. But these days, President Trump has calculated everything out of money, and you have to pay more, or the military exercise is too expensive to do that. He didn't want to waste money on that type of things. So we need to get that basic confidence back first, and then realign all those important agendas in a different way or in a traditional way, and then we can develop a new relations over that.
Thank you. And any comments from our American friends? What do you think Biden on his plate, his first actions on the Korean Peninsula?
It's hard to say right now. A lot of times the first actions of an administration doesn't often deal with foreign policy. It deals with domestic issues and things that a president can get done right away. We've actually done some reporting at the Washington Post over the weekend, my colleagues and I, in terms of what President-elect Biden's first actions will be. It doesn't pertain to foreign policy or not directly foreign policy, but to the Korean Peninsula Peninsula, but they have outlined what his actions are, kind of what he will do on day 1 or day 2, the things that he can do without Congress. And that is 1, rejoin the Paris Climate Accords that the president withdrew from. The official kind of withdrawal date was actually sometime last week. So the Biden administration has made that a priority to get the U.S. back into the climate accords. The second priority is to reinstate its membership in the World Health Organization. We saw the collisions between the Trump administration and the WHO over the coronavirus, and the president and this current president withdrew from that earlier this summer. The Biden administration has indicated to us that that is another priority for day 1, or at least the first days of the administration, and also to repeal the travel ban on some of these majority Muslim countries. The various iterations that were blocked by the courts, but that was ultimately instituted by the Trump administration and upheld by the Supreme Court. The Biden administration plans to repeal that travel ban, and it is something that they can do. There's been legislation on Capitol Hill to get rid of that ban, but obviously, since this travel ban was instituted by executive order on the part of the Trump administration, the Biden administration will get rid of that by executive order. So those are kind of the priorities that they're looking at on day 1. In terms of when they get to the priorities when it comes to Korea policy, I assume that'll take a while. And I think, again, we'll be able to kind of sketch out or get signals of where the president is going and where the incoming president is going in terms of his policies when he does make his cabinet picks, particularly Secretary of State, potentially UN ambassador, defense secretary, who his picks will be, and also just on his personnel at the White House, who don't need confirmation. Who does he pick for national security advisor, and what does he or she have in terms of past Korea policy views? So that's kind of all we're looking for right now. I think you'll be able to glean the most immediately on what his policies will be through his personnel picks, which we expect actually not for a while, perhaps late November, early December. So we do have some time before we start seeing those picks.
Anthony, did you have any comments?
Yes, just very briefly. As I mentioned before, it'll just take a few simple words of reassurance, I think, to settle hearts and minds in South Korea. And actually, President-elect Biden has already said such things in a so-called special contribution to the Yonhap news agency. He said he will try to strengthen the alliance rather than extorting money out of Seoul by threatening to draw down troops, and that he will also engage in principled democracy, which implies that he will not coddle any dictator who strokes his ego. And that particular submission to Yonhap also mentioned 2 nuances, finer points, which I think should have been well received here in South Korea. One is to refer to the importance of the Korean American experience, which affects how people perceive America, and the other to talk about divided families and his hope for a unified future, which we have not heard much of during the Trump administration. So I think he knows what to say, and all he needs to do is repeat it, and that'll go a long way.
Thank you. With that, I think we have to conclude our today's webinar. We still have a couple of more questions, but we have run out of time. I'm sorry for not being able to take those questions. I'd like to thank all the distinguished speakers, especially those joining from Seoul. It's already close to midnight. We decided to conclude this webinar at 9:45 so that they can say they didn't, discuss this issue until the midnight. And I'd also want to thank our technical team and Min-Hye Kim, our program coordinator, for putting this together. And thank you all for joining us. With that, let me conclude today's webinar. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.